I've lived in Willowbrook for 15 years, and what happened at the Martinez family yard sale on September 19, 2020, changed everything I thought I knew about our quiet suburban street. What started as academic curiosity about documenting neighborhood dynamics became something far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. My name is Jennifer Walsh, and I'm a sociology professor at Riverside Community College. I'd been working on a research project about social interactions in suburban communities, specifically focusing on how neighbors establish trust and share information in informal settings. When I heard the Martinez family was having their annual yard sale, I saw it as a perfect opportunity to observe and document authentic neighborhood interactions without the artificial constraints of a laboratory setting. The Martinez family, Roberto, Maria, and their 2 teenage kids Carlos and Sofia, lived 3 houses down from me on Maple Avenue. They'd been having yard sales every fall for the past 8 years, always well-organized affairs that drew people from all over our subdivision and beyond. Roberto worked as a production supervisor at Pacific Manufacturing, pulling 12-hour shifts 4 days a week, while Maria was a registered nurse at Riverside Medical Center working the evening shift. They were the kind of neighbors everyone respected, helpful when you needed them, friendly during casual encounters, but never intrusive or gossipy. I set up my observation post early that Saturday morning around 7:30 a.m., positioning myself strategically in my front yard with a detailed notebook, my laptop, and my reliable 2016 Honda Accord parked at just the right angle so I could document everything while appearing to work on my own weekend projects. The weather was perfectly overcast with intermittent light drizzle, not enough to cancel outdoor activities, but sufficient to keep the casual browsers away, leaving only the serious yard sale enthusiasts and regular neighborhood crowd. The morning started exactly as I'd expected from my preliminary observations over the years. Mrs. Henderson from Cedar Lane arrived first at 8:15 a.m. sharp, like clockwork, methodically going through every single box and table with the thoroughness of a professional appraiser. The Johnsons from directly across the street wandered over around 8:45 with their morning coffee, more interested in catching up on neighborhood gossip than actually purchasing anything. Young couples with strollers began arriving around 9 o'clock, browsing through children's clothing and toys while their kids played safely in the Martinez's well-maintained front yard. For the first hour, everything seemed perfectly normal and aligned with my research expectations. I documented the predictable social patterns, how people approached items they were genuinely interested in versus items they were just browsing, the way conversations naturally developed around shared experiences with similar products, and how neighbors used these informal gatherings to maintain social connections without the pressure of formal social obligations. But around 9:30 a.m., I started noticing something unusual about one particular visitor that immediately caught my attention. A man in his late 30s, average height with dark hair and wearing a plain gray hoodie, had arrived driving a white 2018 Ford Transit van with California plates starting with 8G. Unlike every other yard sale visitor I'd observed, he wasn't actually looking at the merchandise in any meaningful way. Instead, he seemed to be systematically studying the people themselves, particularly taking careful note of which houses different neighbors emerged from and what vehicles they drove. I watched him approach different neighbors with what appeared to be innocent conversation, but his questions were far too specific and focused for casual small talk. He asked Mrs. Chen about how long various families had lived in the neighborhood, who worked what shifts and schedules, which houses had security systems installed, and whether there had been any recent break-ins or crime concerns. Most people answered freely, assuming he was a potential homebuyer considering the area or perhaps someone thinking about moving to our subdivision. But something about his questioning pattern felt wrong. These weren't the random, scattered questions someone would ask if they were genuinely interested in moving to a neighborhood. His inquiries were systematic, methodical, and far too focused on security vulnerabilities and family schedules. When Mrs. Patterson mentioned that her husband traveled frequently for work, leaving her alone for days at a time, I watched him mentally file away that information with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. The first major red flag came when I observed him discreetly photographing license plates in the Martinez's driveway and on the street. He did it casually, pretending to check his phone, but I could clearly see him positioning the camera to capture plate numbers and vehicle details. That's when I started taking my own notes much more seriously, documenting his behavior with the same systematic approach I would use for any academic research project. He spent over 2.5 hours at what should have been a 30-minute browse through a typical suburban yard sale. During that time, I documented him engaging in detailed conversations with at least 15 different neighbors, each time extracting specific information about household routines, work schedules, family compositions, and security measures. The breakthrough moment came around 11:45 a.m. when I overheard him talking to Mrs. Chen from Oak Street. She casually mentioned that her husband David was a district manager at Delta Security Services, responsible for coordinating residential alarm monitoring throughout our area. The moment she said this, the man's entire demeanor shifted. His questions became laser-focused. What routes did security company vehicles take through our subdivision? How often were patrols conducted? Which houses had opted out of monitoring services? And what were the typical response times for alarm calls? That's when I realized with growing alarm that what I was witnessing wasn't innocent neighborhood curiosity, or even casual criminal opportunism. This was professional reconnaissance. Someone was using our community yard sale as a cover for systematic intelligence gathering, mapping out neighborhood vulnerabilities, family schedules, and security gaps with military-like precision. I continued documenting everything, noting that he paid particular attention to houses where no residents had appeared at the yard sale during the morning hours. He asked Maria Martinez pointed questions about neighbors who traveled frequently for work or vacation, claiming he was interested in potential house-sitting opportunities in the area. But his follow-up questions were far too detailed about specific vacation schedules, how long houses typically remained empty, and whether neighbors looked out for each other's properties during absences. Around noon, his behavior became even more disturbing. I watched him systematically writing down addresses while making detailed notes about which houses had elderly residents living alone. When Mr. Patterson, an 82-year-old widower from Elm Drive, mentioned he was still recovering from recent hip replacement surgery and couldn't drive to his physical therapy appointments, the man showed unusual interest in Patterson's exact medical schedule and transportation arrangements. The final alarm bell rang loudly when I observed him approach the Thompson family's 16-year-old daughter Sarah, who was helping her parents manage their section of the sale. He engaged her in what appeared to be casual conversation, but I could see him systematically extracting information about her parents' work schedules, when she was typically home alone after school, whether she had after-school activities or jobs, and what their family's general daily routine looked like. The teenager answered innocently, having no reason to suspect anything inappropriate, but I watched him mentally catalog every detail about when their house would be unoccupied and vulnerable. By 2 p.m., I had filled 12 pages of detailed notes documenting what was clearly criminal surveillance disguised as neighborly interest. This wasn't someone planning to move to our area or even someone with general criminal intent. This was systematic, professional reconnaissance being conducted by someone who understood exactly how to exploit community gatherings for intelligence purposes. When he finally left the yard sale, I made a decision that probably saved multiple families from becoming victims. I followed him in my Honda Accord, maintaining enough distance to avoid detection while keeping him in sight. I needed to confirm my suspicions and gather additional evidence of his criminal intent. He drove methodically through our subdivision at exactly the speed limit, making calculated stops at several houses he'd gathered information about during the yard sale. At each location, he would park his van and sit for several minutes, sometimes using his phone to photograph windows, door locks, security system signs, and what appeared to be sight lines from neighboring houses. He was clearly assessing each target for accessibility, visibility, and potential escape routes. I followed him beyond our subdivision to 3 other neighborhoods that afternoon, watching him repeat exactly the same pattern. He would locate active yard sales or community gatherings, spend hours extracting intelligence from unsuspecting residents, then conduct surveillance on selected targets based on the information he'd gathered. This wasn't random opportunistic crime, this was the systematic preparation phase of organized criminal activity. That evening, I compiled all my observations into a comprehensive 20-page report and contacted Detective Sarah Rodriguez at Metro Police Department. When I explained what I'd witnessed and provided my detailed documentation, she told me something that made my blood run cold. They'd been investigating a series of sophisticated home invasions throughout our area where the perpetrators seemed to know exactly when houses would be empty, which residents were most vulnerable, and how to avoid security systems and neighborhood watch patterns. Detective Rodriguez explained that the burglary ring had been specifically targeting elderly residents living alone, single parents with predictable work schedules, and houses with known security vulnerabilities. But despite months of investigation, they'd never been able to determine how the criminals were gathering such detailed intelligence about their victims. My documentation of the yard sale surveillance had provided the crucial missing piece of their investigation. The police investigation that followed revealed something far more extensive and disturbing than I had imagined. The man I'd observed wasn't operating alone. He was part of a sophisticated criminal network that systematically attended community events throughout the entire county to gather intelligence for multiple criminal purposes. Yard sales, block parties, neighborhood association meetings, school events, church gatherings, anywhere people naturally congregated and shared information about their lives and schedules. Within a week, police had identified the suspect as Marcus Thompson, a 37-year-old with an extensive criminal history including previous convictions for burglary, identity theft, and organized criminal activity. The white Ford Transit van was registered to a shell company that owned a fleet of similar vehicles used by the criminal organization for surveillance and logistics purposes. When they arrested Thompson 3 days later during a surveillance operation at another neighborhood yard sale, police discovered detailed intelligence files on over 200 households across 6 different subdivisions. These weren't simple notes, they were comprehensive dossiers including family compositions, work schedules, vacation patterns, security system details, financial information, and vulnerability assessments. But the most chilling discovery was what they found specifically about our neighborhood. Thompson had identified 12 houses for immediate targeting, including Mr. Patterson's home during his regular physical therapy appointments, the Thompson family's house during Sarah's after-school activities, and Mrs. Chen's residence during her husband's business travel schedule. My documentation and decision to follow him had literally prevented multiple serious crimes from occurring. The case quickly expanded into a federal investigation when authorities discovered the criminal network was selling household intelligence to other criminal organizations across 3 states. What I had witnessed at the Martinez yard sale was just one small component of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that used community events to systematically map out targets for burglary, identity theft, financial fraud, and potentially more serious crimes. Detective Rodriguez later informed me that my detailed behavioral observations provided crucial evidence that led to the arrest of 8 core members of the criminal organization and helped identify connections to similar operations in neighboring states. The federal charges included conspiracy, organized criminal activity, interstate criminal enterprise, and numerous counts of burglary and fraud. Thompson received a 15-year federal sentence as part of a plea agreement that helped authorities dismantle the entire network. The experience fundamentally changed how I view community gatherings and neighborhood safety. What had seemed like innocent social interaction was actually a carefully orchestrated intelligence operation that turned our natural sense of community and neighborly openness against us. The criminals had weaponized our willingness to share information and help strangers, using our fundamental trust in others to make us vulnerable to systematic victimization. Since then, I've presented my findings to neighborhood associations throughout the county, teaching residents how to recognize suspicious behavior at community events while maintaining the positive aspects of neighborhood interaction. The warning signs are subtle but consistent once you know what to look for: excessive interest in personal schedules rather than merchandise, questions about security systems and neighborhood watch patterns, and attempts to gather information about vulnerable residents or empty houses. The Martinez family was devastated to learn their beloved annual yard sale had been exploited as criminal surveillance, but they've continued the tradition with enhanced security awareness. They now coordinate with local police to have an officer present during peak hours, and they've educated other families about recognizing and reporting suspicious behavior at community events. What continues to haunt me is the realization of how many times similar criminal reconnaissance might have occurred at community gatherings without anyone recognizing it. How many burglaries, identity thefts, or worse crimes might have been prevented if we'd been more aware of this type of systematic intelligence gathering disguised as innocent community participation. Have you ever noticed anyone asking unusually detailed questions about your neighborhood or family routines at local events? What seemed like friendly curiosity might actually be something far more dangerous than you realized. I never thought selling my late uncle's art books would expose the dark obsession he'd hidden from our family for over a decade. What happened at our yard sale on November 12, 2021, in Fairview revealed that Uncle Theodore's artistic documentation was actually something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. My name is Amanda Richardson, and I'm a high school art teacher at Clearwater Regional High School. When my Uncle Theodore passed away unexpectedly at 67 from a heart attack, I inherited his extensive collection of art supplies, reference books, and what the family assumed were his artistic works. Theodore had been a semi-professional landscape artist who lived alone in a modest two-bedroom house on Birchway, always claiming he preferred complete solitude for his creative process and artistic inspiration. Theodore's house was absolutely filled with hundreds of art books, professional-grade supplies, easels, and what appeared to be comprehensive reference materials for his landscape paintings. Since I taught art, and had always admired his work, the family naturally assumed I'd want his entire collection. Most of it seemed completely standard technique guides, color theory textbooks, art history references, landscape photography books, and professional painting supplies that any serious artist would accumulate over decades of practice. But when I started systematically organizing everything for the yard sale, sorting through boxes of materials that had been stored in his basement and spare bedroom, I discovered something that made me deeply uncomfortable and increasingly alarmed about my uncle's true activities. Hidden among the hundreds of legitimate art books and supplies were dozens of hand-bound journals filled with Theodore's own reference work. At first glance, they appeared to be typical artist sketchbooks, detailed drawings, and extensive notes about light patterns, shadow techniques, and compositional studies. But as I began flipping through them more carefully, I realized these weren't generic artistic studies or landscape references. Every single drawing, sketch, and notation was specifically focused on his neighbors, their houses, and their detailed daily routines. The journals were meticulously organized by street address and chronological date, creating what amounted to a comprehensive surveillance database. Each neighbor had their own dedicated section with detailed architectural drawings of their homes from multiple angles, accurate sketches of family members including children, and extensive handwritten notes documenting their daily schedules, work patterns, and personal habits. Mrs. Foster from Oak Street had 12 full pages dedicated exclusively to her morning routine, detailed pencil sketches showing her leaving for her 6 a.m. nursing shift at Good Samaritan Hospital, precise notes about which interior and exterior lights she left on for security, detailed drawings of her house from different observation points, and even sketches of her 2017 Toyota Camry with license plate details. What disturbed me most was discovering that Theodore had been systematically watching and documenting families with young children. The Henderson family, who lived 2 houses down from Theodore, had an entire dedicated journal section showing their 2 young daughters' after-school activities, detailed scheduling notes about when parents were home versus at work, and even sketches of the interior room layouts that were visible through windows during evening hours when lights were on. I found comprehensive drawings of the Patterson family's vacation preparations from July 2019, complete with detailed notes about how long they'd be gone, observations about their house security measures, and sketches showing which neighbors had keys or were checking on the property. Theodore had documented the Walsh family's teenage son's part-time job schedule at the local grocery store, and created detailed maps showing which neighbors worked late evening shifts and which houses were consistently empty during specific hours. Each journal entry was precisely dated and cross-referenced with weather conditions, seasonal lighting changes, and neighborhood activity patterns, making it absolutely clear this surveillance operation had been systematic, methodical, and ongoing for many years. Theodore hadn't just been casually observing his neighborhood for artistic inspiration, he'd been conducting professional-level surveillance disguised as legitimate artistic reference gathering. The most chilling discovery was finding a series of specialized journals focused specifically on houses where elderly residents lived alone. Theodore had meticulously documented Mr. Chen's weekly grocery shopping trips to the same supermarket every Tuesday morning, Mrs. Rodriguez's regular physical therapy appointments at the rehabilitation center every Thursday afternoon, and detailed behavioral notes about which neighbors regularly checked on elderly residents, and which ones remained isolated. When I found detailed technical sketches of door locks, window latches, security system control panels, and alarm company signage among what were supposed to be artistic lighting studies, I realized Theodore's documentation went far beyond casual neighborhood observation or even concerning surveillance. These were detailed security vulnerability assessments disguised as artistic reference materials. The journals also contained floor plan sketches of neighbor houses based on observations through windows, notes about expensive items visible from outside, and detailed documentation of family vacation schedules gathered from overheard conversations and observable preparation activities. Theodore had essentially created a comprehensive criminal intelligence database covering his entire neighborhood. I made the extremely difficult decision to contact Detective Kevin Morrison at Fairview Police Department before proceeding with the planned yard sale. When I brought Theodore's journals to the station and showed Detective Morrison the extensive surveillance documentation, his expression grew increasingly serious as he realized the scope and professional nature of what Theodore had been doing. Detective Morrison explained that they'd been actively investigating several recent sophisticated burglaries specifically targeting elderly residents and houses with highly predictable daily schedules. The break-ins showed detailed advanced knowledge of when houses would be empty, which residents were most vulnerable, and how to avoid detection by neighbors or security systems. Theodore's journals potentially provided the missing intelligence source they'd been trying to identify. After consulting with his supervisor and the district attorney's office, Detective Morrison asked me to proceed with the yard sale exactly as planned, but to carefully monitor and document anyone who showed particular interest in Theodore's materials, especially his personal journals. They wanted to determine if anyone else might be involved in what appeared to be a larger surveillance and criminal operation disguised as artistic documentation. During the yard sale on that overcast Saturday morning, I positioned myself strategically where I could observe all interactions while appearing to simply manage the sale. Most buyers were genuinely interested in the legitimate art books, professional supplies, and published reference materials. Several local art teachers and hobbyist painters purchased technique guides and unused supplies at reasonable prices. But around 10:30 a.m., one woman driving a blue 2019 Chevrolet Equinox with Colorado plates ending in 23 showed highly unusual and specific interest in Theodore's personal journals rather than any of the actual art supplies or published books available for purchase. She identified herself as Patricia Williams, claiming to be a professional art collector who specialized in acquiring local artists' reference work and original documentation. But her questions were far too specific and knowledgeable about Theodore's particular documentation methods, and she asked whether he'd shared his neighborhood studies with other artists or students in the area. Patricia offered to pay significantly more than the marked prices specifically for the surveillance journals, claiming they represented unique artistic documentation of suburban life patterns. She showed no interest in Theodore's actual paintings, professional supplies, or published art books, only the handwritten surveillance materials that documented neighbor activities and schedules. When I told her the personal journals weren't for sale and were being retained by the family, I watched her discreetly photograph several journal covers and take detailed notes about Theodore's organizational system and documentation methods. She asked specifically about whether Theodore had taught his observational techniques to other local artists or community education students. After she left, I immediately called Detective Morrison with her license plate information and a detailed description of her unusual interest in the surveillance materials. Within hours, police had identified her actual identity and discovered information that revealed the true scope of Theodore's criminal activities. The investigation revealed that Patricia Williams was actually Patricia Thompson, a 34-year-old with previous arrests for burglary and fraud who had been Theodore's student in a community college art class approximately 5 years earlier. She'd been working directly with Theodore to use his comprehensive neighborhood surveillance documentation for planning and executing targeted burglaries. Theodore's artistic documentation had provided detailed criminal intelligence about when specific houses would be empty, which residents were most vulnerable to crime, optimal timing for break-ins, and how to avoid detection by suspicious neighbors or security systems. The art journals were actually professional criminal reconnaissance materials disguised as legitimate creative reference work. Police investigation revealed that Theodore and Patricia had been directly responsible for at least 8 sophisticated burglaries over the past 2 years, specifically targeting elderly residents during predictable medical appointments and families during well-established work schedules. Theodore's detailed drawings and behavioral notes had provided exact timing windows and security vulnerability information for each targeted residence. The most disturbing revelation was discovering that Theodore had been systematically grooming other community college art students to participate in similar neighborhood documentation projects, under the guise of developing observational drawing skills. Patricia had successfully recruited 2 additional accomplices who were conducting identical surveillance operations in other subdivisions throughout the county. Detective Morrison explained that Theodore's surveillance journals contained enough detailed criminal intelligence to have supported dozens of additional burglaries and potentially more serious crimes if the operation hadn't been discovered and shut down. The artistic disguise had been particularly effective because neighbors simply saw a harmless elderly man sketching outdoors, never suspecting systematic criminal surveillance activities. The investigation expanded when police discovered that Theodore had been teaching advanced observational techniques at 3 different community centers, always emphasizing the importance of documenting daily life patterns and neighborhood dynamics, rather than focusing on traditional artistic subjects like landscapes or still life compositions. Patricia Thompson ultimately received a 12-year federal sentence for organized criminal activity, conspiracy, and multiple counts of burglary. The 2 additional accomplices were arrested and charged with conspiracy, burglary, and criminal surveillance. All of Theodore's extensive surveillance materials became crucial evidence in the prosecution of the entire criminal network. The case led to a broader federal investigation of community art programs and adult education classes that might be used as recruitment centers or covers for criminal surveillance activities. Law enforcement agencies now specifically monitor for instructors or students showing excessive interest in documenting residential areas rather than developing legitimate artistic techniques and skills. Since the investigation concluded, I've presented my experience to art teacher associations, community education coordinators, and neighborhood watch groups throughout the region. We now emphasize the critical importance of monitoring students who show unusual interest in documenting neighborhood security details rather than focusing on actual artistic skill development and creative expression. The experience completely transformed how I view both my uncle and the broader art education community. What I had always interpreted as Theodore's dedication to realistic artistic documentation was actually systematic criminal surveillance that had been hidden from our family for years. Theodore had deliberately used his artistic reputation and our family's complete trust to conceal serious criminal activities that victimized our neighbors and community. Our neighborhood has since implemented comprehensive security awareness programs specifically addressing surveillance activities, and residents now immediately report suspicious photography, sketching, or documentation activities to local police. We've learned that legitimate artistic pursuits can be deliberately exploited as effective covers for criminal reconnaissance and intelligence gathering operations. What continues to haunt me is wondering exactly how long Theodore had been conducting this elaborate surveillance operation and how many other potential criminal targets he'd systematically documented over the years. The journals I discovered represented only the materials he kept stored at his house. There might have been additional surveillance activities, target lists, or criminal partnerships that we never discovered or investigated. Have you ever noticed someone taking unusual interest in systematically documenting your neighborhood activities under the seemingly innocent guise of artistic or academic projects? What appeared to be harmless creative work might actually represent systematic criminal surveillance designed to facilitate serious crimes against you and your neighbors. I never imagined our seemingly friendly neighbor's obsession with collecting would escalate into systematic coercion and harassment that terrorized our entire street. What happened on Sycamore Road between March and August 2022 revealed how dangerous someone's hobby could become when they refuse to accept no for an answer. My name is Michael Torres, and I work as a maintenance supervisor at Central Valley Hospital in Bakersfield. I've lived on Sycamore Road for 8 years with my wife Lisa and our 2 teenage daughters, Emma and Sophia. Our neighborhood had always been quiet and peaceful, the kind of suburban street where kids played safely and neighbors looked out for each other until David Crawford moved into the house directly across from us in February 2022. David was a 45-year-old recently divorced man who worked remotely as some kind of software consultant for tech companies. He seemed completely normal during our initial interactions, polite during neighborhood introductions, kept his yard meticulously maintained, never caused any noise problems or disturbances. His house was a modest 2-story colonial that he'd purchased after his divorce, and he appeared to be just another quiet professional trying to rebuild his life. But within just a few weeks of moving in, David's behavior became increasingly intrusive and concerning in ways that none of us initially recognized as dangerous warning signs. It started innocuously enough with David showing up at our front door unannounced on a Saturday morning, asking if we had any vintage items we might be willing to sell. He claimed to be a serious collector of 1980s and 1990s memorabilia, electronics, toys, household items, basically anything manufactured during those specific decades. When we politely told him we weren't interested in selling our personal belongings, he seemed disappointed but appeared to accept our answer gracefully. But David didn't give up after that first refusal. Over the next several weeks, he systematically approached every single house on our street with identical requests, always focusing on the same time periods and types of items. The Patterson family told me he'd offered them $200 cash for an old Nintendo Entertainment System that their teenage sons still used regularly for gaming. Mrs. Henderson said he'd actually asked to search through her garage and basement for overlooked treasures she might not realize were valuable collectibles. The situation began escalating when David started pressuring neighbors to organize yard sales specifically so he could have opportunities to browse through their personal belongings. He offered to help with advertising on Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace, assist with setup and organization, and even help with pricing items if families would just give him first access to anything from his target decades before other buyers arrived. Some neighbors initially agreed to his requests, thinking it was harmless and might actually be profitable to have someone knowledgeable about collectible values helping them price items appropriately. The Rodriguez family organized a small yard sale in late March, and David spent nearly 4 hours going through every box and table with obsessive thoroughness. But David's behavior at these neighborhood yard sales quickly became aggressive and completely inappropriate. At the Chin family sale in early April, he arrived 30 minutes before the posted 8 a.m. start time and demanded to see items that weren't displayed for public sale. When they politely refused to sell him their children's collection of vintage Transformers toys, he became argumentative and accused them of false advertising since he'd specifically requested access to 1980s collectibles. The Rodriguez family told me David had become genuinely angry when they wouldn't sell him a family photograph that happened to be displayed in a 1980s picture frame he wanted for his collection. He'd offered increasingly large amounts of money for just the frame, eventually reaching $300 for what was obviously a $5 thrift store item, becoming more agitated and persistent with each refusal. They were forced to end their yard sale 2 hours early just to get him to leave their property. By May, David's tactics had evolved into something much more manipulative and genuinely concerning. He began conducting detailed research using property records and social media accounts to identify which specific neighbors might own items from his target time periods. He'd approach people with unnervingly specific knowledge about their possessions, mentioning items he couldn't possibly have seen without conducting some form of surveillance or unauthorized observation. Mrs. Walsh discovered David had been photographing her house during different times of day, apparently trying to see through windows to catalog potential collectibles visible inside her home. When she confronted him directly about this behavior, he unconvincingly claimed he was documenting neighborhood architecture for a photography project, but couldn't provide any reasonable explanation for why he only photographed certain houses or focused on interior views rather than architectural features. The harassment began intensifying significantly when neighbors stopped agreeing to his yard sale requests and started avoiding his approaches entirely. David began leaving handwritten notes in mailboxes, offering increasingly specific amounts for items he'd somehow identified inside people's homes. The notes became progressively more demanding in tone, suggesting that neighbors were being selfish and unreasonable by not giving him opportunities to purchase items they probably didn't appreciate or understand the value of anyway. In June, David's behavior crossed the line into genuinely threatening territory. When the Thompson family refused to organize a yard sale despite his repeated requests over several weeks, he began parking his 2020 Ford F-150 pickup truck outside their house during various hours throughout the day, just sitting in the cab and watching their activities. Mrs. Thompson told me she felt like he was trying to intimidate them into compliance with his demands. The breaking point for our entire neighborhood came when David started approaching our teenage children and other young people in the area, asking them to convince their parents to sell family belongings. He offered kids cash rewards for providing detailed information about what vintage items their families owned, essentially trying to turn children into informants against their own parents. This crossed every possible boundary of appropriate adult behavior. Several families reported that David had begun making veiled threats about property values and neighborhood harmony when his collecting requests were denied. He suggested that neighbors who didn't participate in his collecting activities were somehow damaging community relationships and negatively affecting everyone's property values through their uncooperative attitudes. By July, David had systematically contacted every household on our street multiple times, maintaining what appeared to be detailed written records of who owned specific items and carefully tracking which families had refused his various requests. His persistence had evolved from merely annoying to genuinely frightening, as he absolutely refused to accept any refusal as final and seemed to view every no as simply a negotiating position. The situation reached a genuine crisis point when David began accessing neighbors' private property without permission to conduct unauthorized searches for collectibles. The Johnson family discovered him inside their backyard storage shed at 6 a.m. one morning, going through their stored belongings. When confronted, he claimed he thought it was some kind of shared community storage area, despite the fact that it was clearly on private property behind a locked gate. When I finally confronted David directly about his increasingly inappropriate and illegal behavior, he became immediately defensive and hostile. He accused all the neighbors of conspiring against him and claimed we were deliberately preventing him from pursuing his legitimate business interests as a collector. His responses revealed how completely distorted his thinking had become about his supposed right to access other people's private property and personal belongings. After consulting with several other affected neighbors, I contacted Deputy Sheriff Maria Santos about David's escalating pattern of harassment, stalking, and trespassing behavior. She explained that law enforcement had been receiving reports about similar problems with aggressive collectors who refused to accept boundaries, but David's systematic and organized approach was particularly concerning and potentially dangerous. The police investigation that followed revealed the true scope of David's obsessive behavior. He had been using multiple online databases, property records, and extensive social media surveillance to research neighbors' possessions before making his collecting requests. Officers discovered he'd created detailed files on every household in our neighborhood, including family compositions, work schedules, children's activities, and estimated values of target items he'd identified through various surveillance methods. The investigation expanded when police discovered that David had outstanding restraining orders from his previous neighborhood in Modesto, where he'd engaged in identical escalating behavior that had ultimately resulted in breaking and entering charges when residents continued refusing to sell him collectibles. He'd been legally forced to relocate after multiple arrests and criminal charges related to harassment and property crimes. Further investigation revealed that David's pattern of behavior wasn't limited to just our neighborhood. He had been systematically targeting suburban communities throughout the Central Valley region, using the same sophisticated approach of research, surveillance, coercion, and escalating harassment when residents refused to accommodate his collecting obsessions. David Crawford was arrested on multiple charges including stalking, criminal harassment, trespassing, burglary, violation of existing restraining orders, and intimidation of witnesses. During the search of his residence, police discovered extensive surveillance files on dozens of neighborhoods, detailed maps of targeted houses, and thousands of photographs taken without consent of neighbors' homes and possessions. During the court proceedings that followed, we learned that David's collecting behavior was actually a manifestation of severe hoarding disorder that had become criminally compulsive over several years. Mental health professionals testified that his complete inability to accept refusal and his overwhelming sense of entitlement to other people's belongings represented serious psychological disturbance requiring intensive treatment and supervision. David ultimately received an 18-month jail sentence followed by 3 years of supervised probation, including mandatory psychological counseling and treatment for his compulsive hoarding behaviors. He was also legally prohibited from contacting any residents on our street, and was required to relocate outside our county as a condition of his probation. The existing restraining orders were expanded to cover our entire neighborhood and surrounding areas. Since David's arrest and removal from our community, Sycamore Road has returned to its normal peaceful atmosphere, but the experience taught all of us crucial lessons about recognizing when someone's supposed hobby or business interest actually represents predatory and potentially dangerous behavior. We now immediately report anyone who shows excessive interest in neighbors' possessions or demonstrates an inability to accept appropriate boundaries about private property. The incident has led to significantly increased awareness throughout our broader community about how collectors, resellers, or other individuals can use seemingly innocent requests as covers for harassment, surveillance, and property crimes. We've learned that persistent refusal to accept no as an answer, combined with escalating tactics, represents a serious warning sign that should never be ignored. What continues to concern me most is wondering how many other neighborhoods David had systematically targeted before focusing on ours, and whether his documented pattern of escalating behavior had ever resulted in more serious violent crimes when residents continued refusing his increasingly aggressive demands. Our experience has been shared with neighborhood watch groups throughout Bakersfield and surrounding communities as an example of how seemingly harmless collecting interests can mask serious criminal intentions and dangerous psychological disorders that threaten entire communities. Have you ever encountered someone whose collecting interests seem to cross appropriate boundaries with neighbors or community members? What initially appeared to be innocent hobby enthusiasm might actually represent deeply concerning patterns of harassment, surveillance, and complete inability to respect other people's property rights and personal boundaries. What I witnessed on Chestnut Avenue in Phoenix between January and December 2023 still haunts me. Margaret Williams held yard sales every single Saturday for an entire year until she'd sold literally everything she owned, including items that no rational person would ever part with. By the time I was called for a wellness check, she was living in a completely empty house with nothing but the clothes on her back. I'm Detective Lisa Chin with Phoenix Police Department, and I first encountered Margaret during what should have been a routine wellness check in late November 2023. What I discovered that day revealed a year-long pattern of systematic self-destruction disguised as innocent weekend yard sales that had completely destroyed this woman's ability to maintain basic living conditions. Margaret Williams was 58 years old, recently divorced after a bitter 23-year marriage, living alone in a modest 1,200 square foot ranch house on Chestnut Avenue in a quiet residential neighborhood. Her neighbors initially thought her weekly yard sales were just her healthy way of downsizing and moving forward after the traumatic end of her marriage. Nobody realized she was systematically dismantling every aspect of her life, one Saturday sale at a time. The pattern started seemingly normal enough in January 2023. Margaret began setting up folding tables in her driveway every Saturday morning at exactly 7 a.m., selling typical household items that any recently divorced person might want to get rid of: duplicate kitchen dishes, romance novels from her marriage, clothes that no longer fit her changing lifestyle, decorative items that reminded her of happier times with her ex-husband. Her next-door neighbor, Patricia Johnson, a retired teacher who'd lived on Chestnut Avenue for over 15 years, told me Margaret initially seemed energetic and genuinely positive during those early sales. Margaret would chat enthusiastically with customers about starting fresh, decluttering her life, and embracing minimalism as part of her post-divorce recovery process. Everyone thought she was handling her major life transition remarkably well. But by March, Patricia noticed Margaret was selling items that seemed more functional than decorative. She watched Margaret sell her microwave one Saturday, then her coffee maker the following weekend, then her dining room table and matching chairs the week after that. When Patricia casually asked how Margaret was managing to eat and drink coffee without these basic appliances, Margaret cheerfully explained she was learning to live simply, and discovering she didn't need as much as she thought. The sales continued with almost mechanical precision every single Saturday throughout the spring and summer. Margaret would spend her weekdays carefully preparing items for sale, researching appropriate prices on eBay and Facebook Marketplace, creating elaborate display arrangements, and maintaining detailed handwritten records of everything she sold. She treated each weekly sale like a professional retail business operation, developing relationships with regular customers and even offering layaway plans for expensive items. By June, some of Margaret's longtime customers began expressing genuine concern about her selling patterns. Mrs. Rodriguez, a local antique dealer who had been attending Margaret's sales regularly since February, told me she watched Margaret sell her large-screen television, her stereo system, and eventually all of her living room furniture over consecutive weekends. When Mrs. Rodriguez asked how Margaret was spending her leisure time without entertainment equipment, Margaret claimed she preferred reading books and practicing meditation in her newly uncluttered space. The situation became obviously problematic during August when Margaret started selling deeply personal items that clearly suggested serious underlying mental health issues. She put her late mother's jewelry collection up for sale, including her mother's wedding ring and pearl necklace that obviously held tremendous sentimental value. She sold family photographs in their frames, heirloom furniture that had belonged to her grandparents, and even her own wedding album from her failed marriage. When longtime customers expressed discomfort about purchasing such obviously personal and meaningful items, Margaret insisted that everything was just stuff that was holding her back from moving forward and preventing her from becoming who she was meant to be. Her responses became increasingly rehearsed and defensive, as if she'd prepared standard answers for anyone who questioned her selling decisions. Margaret's younger sister Jennifer made an emergency trip from Tucson in September after learning about the extensive weekend sales from concerned neighbors who'd managed to find her contact information online. Jennifer was horrified to discover Margaret sleeping on an inflatable air mattress in a completely empty house, cooking simple meals with a single-burner camping stove, and using plastic lawn chairs as her only remaining furniture. Despite the obviously problematic living conditions, Margaret insisted to her sister that she'd never felt freer or happier in her entire life. By October, Margaret had escalated to selling essential appliances that no reasonable person would dispose of. Her full-size refrigerator appeared at one Saturday sale, followed by her washing machine and dryer the next weekend, and then even her water heater the week after that. Neighbors watched in growing alarm as Margaret began purchasing bags of ice from the convenience store to keep food cold in a cooler, and they observed her hand-washing clothes in her backyard using a garden hose and laundry detergent. When concerned neighbors approached Margaret about these obviously problematic living arrangements, she maintained elaborate explanations about embracing a back-to-basics lifestyle, claiming she was conducting a personal experiment in sustainable living, and insisting that modern appliances were unnecessary luxuries that distracted from authentic human experience. The final weeks of Margaret's year-long liquidation were genuinely disturbing to witness. She sold her entire winter wardrobe in November, despite Phoenix's cooler months requiring appropriate clothing for outdoor activities and temperature regulation. She sold her 2019 Honda Civic in early December, claiming she was embracing walking and public transportation as part of her commitment to environmental responsibility, even though Phoenix's public transportation system was inadequate for reaching her part-time job at a local bookstore. Regular customers who had initially enjoyed Margaret's sales began reporting that she seemed increasingly manic and overly talkative during these final weeks, defending her extreme choices with elaborate philosophical justifications about materialism, spiritual growth, and personal transformation that didn't align with her obviously deteriorating living situation. The wellness check that brought me into Margaret's situation came after multiple neighbors independently reported seeing her sitting alone in her completely dark house at night, using candles for illumination after she'd sold all her lamps, light fixtures, and even the basic electrical outlets covers throughout her home. When I arrived at Margaret's address on November 28, 2023, I found a 58-year-old woman living in conditions that clearly constituted severe self-neglect, but who presented herself as completely rational and satisfied with her lifestyle choices. The house was literally empty, no furniture, no appliances, no decorations, no possessions of any kind except the clothes she was currently wearing and a single sleeping bag on the floor. Margaret had systematically sold everything over the course of 11 months: her bed and mattress, all kitchen appliances including the stove and dishwasher, light fixtures and electrical covers, bathroom fixtures including the medicine cabinet and toilet paper holder, closet doors and even some interior door handles, window treatments, and flooring rugs. She was essentially squatting in her own house, living in conditions that would be considered uninhabitable by any reasonable standard. During our initial conversation, Margaret maintained that she was spiritually cleansed and finally free from material attachments that had controlled her life for decades. She insisted that her systematic disposal of possessions was a deliberate philosophical choice rather than compulsive behavior, and she seemed genuinely confused about why anyone would consider her living situation problematic or concerning. Through careful questioning, Margaret eventually revealed the psychological motivation behind her year-long systematic liquidation of everything she owned. Her divorce had been particularly traumatic, involving her husband's affair with a close friend, significant financial betrayal that left her with substantial debt, and a bitter custody battle over their adult children's loyalties that had destroyed several important family relationships. Margaret had developed an obsessive belief that material possessions were somehow preventing her from starting over completely and achieving the personal transformation she felt was necessary to recover from her marriage's devastating end. The weekly yard sales had evolved from practical downsizing into compulsive behavior that provided temporary feelings of control and accomplishment during a period when most aspects of her life felt chaotic and unmanageable. Margaret's case presented complex legal and ethical challenges because she was technically competent to make her own decisions and consistently claimed her choices were voluntary and beneficial. However, her complete disposal of basic living necessities including essential appliances, appropriate clothing, and furniture necessary for maintaining health and safety clearly indicated serious psychological distress requiring professional intervention rather than respect for personal autonomy. Working closely with Adult Protective Services and Margaret's sister Jennifer, we arranged emergency temporary housing and comprehensive psychiatric evaluation to assess Margaret's mental health status and decision-making capacity. The evaluation process took several weeks because Margaret initially refused to acknowledge that her behavior represented anything other than successful personal growth and spiritual development. Margaret was eventually diagnosed with severe clinical depression with obsessive-compulsive features that had been triggered and exacerbated by the multiple traumas associated with her divorce. The weekly yard sales had become a systematic form of self-harm through deliberate material deprivation, providing temporary relief from emotional pain while ultimately creating new problems that compounded her underlying psychological distress. The treatment process was complicated because Margaret had developed elaborate intellectual justifications for her self-destructive behavior, making it difficult for mental health professionals to help her recognize the connection between her emotional trauma and her compulsive selling patterns. She spent 3 months in a residential treatment facility, working specifically on her relationship with material possessions and developing healthier coping mechanisms for managing major life transitions and traumatic experiences. Margaret's family, led by her sister Jennifer, coordinated a careful process of helping her gradually rebuild the basic household necessities required for independent living while she continued intensive outpatient therapy. The rebuilding process had to be managed carefully to prevent triggering renewed compulsions to dispose of items during stressful periods or emotional setbacks. She eventually relocated to a smaller 2-bedroom apartment in Scottsdale to be closer to her sister's support system and established care team. Margaret continues to struggle with impulses to dispose of possessions during particularly stressful periods, but she's learned to recognize these urges as symptoms of her underlying mental health condition requiring professional support rather than acting on them impulsively. The recovery process took over a year of intensive individual therapy, group counseling, and family support coordination. Margaret now volunteers with divorce support groups throughout the Phoenix area, sharing her experience about how grief and trauma can manifest in unexpected self-destructive behaviors that often appear rational or even positive to outside observers who don't understand the underlying psychological dynamics. Margaret's case fundamentally changed how I approach situations involving excessive disposal of personal property. I learned that compulsive selling can be just as psychologically destructive as compulsive hoarding, but it's often less visible to outside observers and may even be praised as successful downsizing or minimalist lifestyle choices rather than recognized as symptoms of serious mental health crises. Since handling Margaret's case, I've encountered 3 additional situations where individuals used yard sales, online marketplaces, or donation activities to engage in self-destructive disposal of necessary possessions during acute mental health episodes. It's become a behavioral pattern I specifically watch for during wellness checks and when responding to community complaints about unusual neighbor activities. The experience taught our entire department about the importance of looking beyond surface appearances when evaluating potentially problematic situations involving community members who seem to be making dramatic lifestyle changes. What appears to be positive personal growth or successful adaptation to life changes may actually represent serious psychological distress requiring professional intervention and community support. Margaret's recovery continues to be an ongoing process requiring consistent professional support and family involvement. She's gradually rebuilt a basic household and maintained stable housing for over 6 months, which represents significant progress from her complete material deprivation. However, she remains vulnerable to renewed compulsive selling during periods of high stress or emotional instability. What concerns me most about Margaret's case is wondering how many other people in our community might be engaging in similar self-destructive behaviors without anyone recognizing the underlying psychological distress that requires intervention rather than admiration for their apparent entrepreneurial success or lifestyle simplification efforts. Have you ever noticed someone in your community selling personal belongings in ways that seemed excessive, concerning, or inconsistent with maintaining basic living standards? What initially appeared to be successful downsizing or smart financial management might actually represent serious psychological distress requiring professional support and community intervention rather than praise for personal discipline or lifestyle choices. Thanks so much for watching. I can't express enough how much your support means. The likes, the comments, it all really helps the channel grow. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. I always take the time to read them. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss out on any new videos. See you next time.